Good morning. Today we're going to talk about Jonah chapter 2, and it's Jonah's prayer. So if you will turn in your Bibles to Jonah chapter 2 and pause me and read Jonah chapter 2. It's pretty quick. So, it is pretty quick. It's a brief prayer, and it's been said that this prayer could be read in less than a minute, which, the lesson learned here is these long, drawn-out prayers aren't necessarily any better than the short 1-minute prayers or 1-second prayers. There's no time limit to a prayer. So in verse 1, it says that Jonah is inside the fish. The Hebrew word for this fish is not specific, so it could be a fish, it could be a whale, could be, some people that I read called it monsters, a sea monster, but I'm just going to call it a fish, just pretty generic there. And so the question is, why does God use such a dramatic event, such an unusual event to get Jonah's attention? Because obviously he doesn't always use these events, but Jonah was a hardcore, I'm going to use the word pro-Israel, and that's he was hardcore. Most of the Jews at the time were. They thought Israel ruled the world and was God's favored nation, which it was. But they were a little arrogant in that, and to the point that they were very vengeful towards non-Jewish people or Gentiles, and they were to the point of hatred. They just hated anyone who wasn't a Jew. They hated them. They just did not want anything good to happen to them, and they wanted God to use all of his energy on Israel and just pretty much let the rest of the world die. Just didn't like them. So God sometimes uses big events in these hardcore people's lives because it's harder to explain away. So sometimes we get a little nudge from God that says, you really need to write a note today. Well, that could just be a happenstance, a circumstance. You happen to think of that person and, well, that's just a circumstance. So you can explain that away. But being swallowed up by a fish, that's pretty hard to explain away. And even if you tell someone and they don't believe you yourself, it's hard to explain it away to yourself. Oh yeah, I was swallowed by a fish. I know I was swallowed by a fish. I don't know who else believes I was swallowed by a fish, but I know. So I know that had to have been from God. So sometimes, even though other people don't believe God is talking to us, he is, and it's hard for us to explain it away. So this whole chapter is Jonah's prayer from inside the fish. So it was recorded, obviously, after he was outside the fish, because I don't think he took paper and pencil with him, but it was not a prayer after he was outside the fish. So in verse 2, which to me is just the very first part, is a huge part. I called and God answered. That's pretty simple, but it's such a hard truth for us to sometimes grasp. And in the second part of that verse, from the depths of the grave, or Sheol, and Sheol is that Hebrew term for the realm of the dead. So some scholars believe that Jonah actually died inside the fish. Some don't. Again, there's no real way of knowing. In verse 3, you hurled me into the deep, you cast me into the waters, depending on your version. And the you there is important because Jonah has already kind of forgiven the crew, and we'll come back to that, forgiven the crew because he's saying God did it. The crew didn't do it, even though the crew physically lifted him up and put him overboard. And the currents swirled about me. And the currents, I thought this was interesting, did not know this. The currents in the Mediterranean flow from west Spain to east. And so the currents were swirling about him and the waves breaking over him. And then verse 4 said, from inside the fish again, I will look again towards your holy temple. I've been banished, I've been bad, but I know that I'm going to look again towards your holy temple. So, Jonah says this with belief. This is a reality to him. He believes that he will look towards the holy temple again. He'll be back in Jerusalem. Now, some people use this to date the book. This is just kind of an aside. The temple was actually destroyed in 856 BC, and that was after an 18-month siege. But the temple itself was, I'm going to say, morally corrupt way before then. Some of the kings had sold the stuff out of the treasury, and again, there's that whole Ark of the Covenant thing. Where is it? Who knows? So some people try and say that this was before, after, around. Just know that this was obviously before the temple was destroyed, because Jonah thought he was going to see it again. Verse 5, the seaweed. The waters threatened him. The seaweed was wrapped around my head. Oh my gosh, what these scholars can get into believing. I mean, they made a whole big deal over seaweed being wrapped around his head. Some of them say that this could not have happened because there would be no seaweed inside the whale fish. Some think that, oh yes, the fish would have swallowed seaweed along with Jonah. And some, who I tend to agree with, is again, this prayer is before the fish. He's in the fish, but this part is when he's sinking. When he's sinking, he thinks he's going to drown. The currents are carrying him along. The waters are over him. There's seaweed around his head. But again, everybody has an opinion. Verse 6, again, he's sinking. He thinks this is it. I'm going to drown. But you brought me up from the pit. You brought me up. Now, you brought me up by having a fish swallow me, but you still brought me up. So sometimes the way we want to get saved is not the way we get saved, but we don't need to look a gift horse in the mouth. And he wasn't. He was very excited that this fish swallowed him because he didn't drown. So sometimes we tend to, maybe, I don't like the way you saved me. This is not the way I wanted to be saved. Take your redemption and go with it. And verse 7, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you. Again, some scholars say, oh, it was too late. He waited till his life was ebbing away to ask God to remember the Lord. But maybe it's saying, even then, even when my life was ending, or I thought it was ending, I remembered the Lord. And again, he talks about raising the prayer to the Holy Temple. We go back to that verse 4 where they're trying to date everything. In verse 8, this was an interesting verse. It's pretty self-explanatory. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. Well, remember when he kind of acted like he was forgiving the crew? This could have been a kind of a dig at them again. Now remember, Jonah, he's hardcore anti-Jews, so Gentiles, the crew. He's hardcore against them. Another reason, he may have been asleep, trying to get away from them. He may have been in the hold of the ship, trying to get away from the crew. Not sure if that's what he's referring to or not, but it could be. But the word for worthless idols here, another way of saying that is lying vanities. So we think of worthless idols. Well, we don't worship idols. We don't worship carved statues or miniature figurines of gods, or we don't worship Baal or Molech or Isis. We don't worship those things. But do we worship lying vanities? So vanities that lie to us, that make us feel better. And there was a list in one of the commentaries I read, and I thought this was a pretty interesting list. I'll just read it to you. It's alcohol, ambition, automobiles, greed, Hollywood, music, money, nicotine, pleasure, having fun, science, sport, and sex. So, yeah, I think all of us could probably say yes to a lot of those, maybe. Anyway, so are those things we really need to think about? We go on to verse 9, and Jonah's thankful, but he's, again, convinced he's going to make sacrifices, and and he makes a vow, and he acknowledges that God is in charge of salvation. Big step for him. Big step, because, again, he's not wanting anyone but Israel to be saved. And in verse 10, the Lord spoke to the fish, and the fish vomited Jonah onto dry land. Now, Josephus, who is that great historian, says that Jonah was deposited on dry land on the shore of the Euxine Sea, and that's really the Black Sea. That's an ancient kind of name for the Black Sea, which means that the fish had gone through the Aegean Sea up by Greece and through that little the straits there at Istanbul, which is called the Dardanelles, and was that's a long way. But in 3 days, I don't know how far a fish/whale can travel in 3 days. And then I'm going to ask you in closing to read Matthew 12:39 through 41. And this whole concept of 3 days and 3 nights and being raised again. And was Jonah dead in the fish or merely just waiting? And you can draw your own conclusions, but as we close, you can stop me and read Matthew 12:39 through 41. And we'll see you next time for Jonah 3.